Hi, Jessica here. Just a quick note before we begin. This episode came out before Reimagining the Workplace became the ReImagination Café. Same spirit, same heart, just a new name that better reflects how we've evolved. Hello and welcome to the Reimagining the Workplace podcast. I'm Jessica Cherry. As a very young girl, I never really thought about my body, whether it was good or bad, right or wrong. It was just a vessel that I lived in, and as long as it got me where I needed to go, all was well. When I got a little bit older, like many adolescent girls, I gave it more thought and became more critical of my appearance. Yeah, my nose was kind of crooked, and I definitely looked much prettier on a horse if my legs were about 4 inches longer. But one thing I never thought about or questioned was whether I was a girl. I just was. It was such a given that no matter how hard I try, I can't recall a single instance when I even thought about it. But for someone who is transgender, someone whose gender identity or gender expression does not correspond with their sex assigned at birth, their experience may be very different. While many trans individuals know at a very young age that their gender does not match the body they're living in, others may feel that something's off, but it may take years before they realize that it's because of their gender identity. While every trans experience is unique, most trans individuals wrestle with how open to be about their gender identity, wondering, how will people react? Will people be uncomfortable around me? And of course, will I still be loved? In our workplaces, there are certainly transgender individuals who have positive experiences in the workplace, and we'll hear one such story today. But many faced a host of challenges, from stigma and discrimination, to pressure to manage their identities, to hostilities and tensions surrounding which bathroom they use. The calculation of whether to reveal their gender identity at work is complicated, and again there are questions. Will revealing this aspect of myself impede my career progression? Will people avoid me or not want to work with me? Will I be safe? At this time in our history in particular, when trans individuals have become a focal point in our culture wars, our trans colleagues need their employers, and all of us really, to step up and to build workplace cultures where they are treated with dignity and respect, and where they feel like they can bring their whole, authentic selves to work. My guest today, Jess Skaare, is a daughter, a sister, a lover of Lego. She literally has multiple storage units filled with her custom Lego creations, and a person of faith. She has a background in web development, user experience, branding, and design. And for the past 16 years, she has worked at Pfizer in their New York corporate headquarters. Jess is also transgender, and after grappling with her gender identity for many years, she officially came out in August of 2023. And since then, as part of her mission to raise awareness and increase understanding of the trans experience, Jess regularly shares her personal story at conferences, on podcasts, and in other forums. Jess is passionate about creating workplace cultures that are affirming and inclusive for trans people. And she has many ideas about how to do that, drawing on her own very positive experience transitioning and coming out while working at Pfizer. And we're extremely fortunate that Jess has agreed to be here and to share her insights with us today. Just before we dive in, I want to let our listeners know that we've released a special supplemental background track, which you can find on the Reimagining the Workplace website. That's reimaginingtheworkplace.net, which includes more of my conversation with Jess about her personal experience grappling with her gender identity. So for anyone who may be interested in learning more about Jess's personal story, I'd encourage you to check that out. Okay, so let's get started. Jess, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you. Just to do the formal stuff, I do want to state up front that all the things I'm going to talk about are my own opinion. I'm sharing things only from my own perspective. And while I am a colleague of Pfizer, I'm not speaking as a representative of the company, and I'm sharing my own thoughts.
Sure, of course. So Jess, I'm going to summarize a little bit about your background for our listeners. You were born and raised in Pittsburgh by wonderful parents who adopted you and your brother. Your father has his master's in divinity, so you had a strong grounding in church life. And I know you look back on your time growing up very fondly. So at what point did you start to grapple with your gender identity? Is that something you thought about or struggled with as a child?
I have different limited memories of my childhood, but I didn't necessarily have a certitude about my gender being off. I think there is a sense of something being disrupted, but not as sure as I've seen from other people's journeys who are trans.
As part of my research for this conversation, I read a book by Jennifer Finney Boylan called She's Not There, where Jennifer describes her very personal story, her trans experience, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And she shares that when she was 3 years old, she knew with complete certainty that she was a girl. And I've heard several other stories of people who at a very young age knew intuitively that they were a certain gender, even though it didn't match the body they were living in. And I actually think that that may be the narrative that people are most familiar with. But of course, it's not the only story. And in fact, your story is quite different and equally important to share. So can you tell us a bit about your experience?
Of course. What I first want to say, Jennifer's story is so valid and powerful and true. Even though we have different experiences, that's, I think, one of the things to help people understand is that the experiences are not all the same. I think that journey that she described, not only is it certainly common and happens to a lot of people, but for a long time, it was believed to be the only story. And so if you wanted to get care from a doctor, if you wanted to talk to a psychiatrist, if you wanted to get anything, especially from insurance, you sometimes had to give that story to receive any care because any other journey wasn't seen as valid or legitimate, which again, not to say that that's not real. It's a very real and very common story. But yeah, for others, it's not quite as stark.
So looking back today to those early days growing up in Pittsburgh, were there signs of gender dysphoria even way back then?
When I look back on those times, I think I can see signs. I think I can see, oh, that probably meant X and Y, but I have to be kind of careful with myself not to make too many presumptions that what's being through the lens of my current experience looking back and what was actually signs of gender dysphoria back then.
And can you define gender dysphoria for our audience?
Absolutely. And by the way, for all these things, obviously, I'm giving my personal story, my personal impressions. And so then to a degree, my personal definition. Gender dysphoria, to the degree to which your gender is innate, that you have a sense of who you are and what your gender is. And for those who are experiencing dysphoria, it's recognizing that there is dissonance, an emotional and often physical distress that comes from your body not matching who you are in your head. It's something that used to be thought of as a mental illness. It's not. And I think that's a big thing to correct because a lot of people still think that. The American Psychiatric Association no longer lists it as a mental disorder. They haven't for quite a while. In the current DSM guidelines, it is recognized as this sort of physical experience. And it's something that can happen to trans people. It's not necessary to have it to be trans. It's often just more of a reality if you're don't get to grapple with your gender identity, then dysphoria can emerge, and dysphoria can lead to lots of different problems, especially different kinds of distress and anxiety that you might experience that people who are the same as their gender assigned at birth don't experience because they don't have that same dissonance.
So what was your first experience thinking of yourself as or identifying with girls?
I grew up in the 80s and 90s when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon was very popular. And that was my go-to. I loved that cartoon. And that's actually one of my earliest memories, thinking back, was having a dream. And my dreams for a long time were me being in an episode of the Turtles, and I was going on these different adventures. But it was really about me and April, where April and I were doing all these different things, and we maybe were hiding from the bad guys or something. And for a lot of those things, I was thinking, oh, I want April to be my girlfriend. And that was an aspect of those dreams. But also it kind of snuck up on me. I was always dreaming about wanting to disguise myself as her. Like I had to find ways to, again, escape the bad guys in those dreams and disguise it. I think that notion of disguising myself was the cover my brain gave me to think about it in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise felt comfortable doing. It wasn't common when I was growing up to see any positive trans representation in anything, any kind of media. I mean, I'm sure those people were out there. I know they were out there, now in hindsight, going back and reading about people across millennia who have been out and about. But for me growing up, if you saw something on TV, it was as a punchline in a sitcom. It was on Jerry Springer, which I wasn't allowed to watch that anyway as a kid. So it's already like double something that was forbidden and wrong. I think I always felt like something was off, but I didn't necessarily get that it was because of gender, that it was my gender identity that was the most off thing. But if I had seen other examples, maybe I might have reached conclusions quicker.
And how did things progress during middle school, high school, and college?
So I think, again, because there's that association, not only that anything trans was wrong and a joke, but it was also that if you encountered anything in the trans universe, it was usually related to porn. It was usually something that had a heavy sexual connotation to it. But that other association is where, for me, when I would struggle with aspects of gender identity, or I would think about or dream about being a different version of me, I had the added shame of not only being, all right, this isn't the way I'm supposed to be thinking of myself as a girl, but it was also, this is something that's unchristian of me because I'm thinking of sexual desire. Like it was wrapped up to a degree where I was concerned that I was just expressing a fetish and that was therefore wrong and therefore I shouldn't be doing any of this. Without the dysphoria to know for sure what was off about me, coupled with that shame, everything was just packed in a box and put into the back of my brain. It was something I didn't actively engage with because I didn't want to.
Right, that box you don't want to open, but then when you don't, it keeps getting heavier somehow.
I used a phrase that felt right to me in doing my coming out story actually last year when I finally came out to everybody, was that I felt unknowably broken.
Very powerful language there. So after high school, you went to Penn State, got a great education. You have thoughts and maybe some fantasies about being a girl or a woman and presenting that way. But this fetish, as you thought of it, stays hidden away. And then you get a job at Cardinal Health, move to Dublin, Ohio. You start off as a developer for their internal website. Your role expands to include their external website. So professionally, things are going pretty well, right?
Yeah, I had a great start to my career, which was going quite successfully.
So now you're living on your own, no college roommates. So this is when you start experimenting with dressing up, wearing makeup, etc. Can you tell us about that?
After college, when I would finally try to indulge some of those dressing up fantasies and order clothes online. You could order things online. That was relatively new. So I could go out and get things and I wouldn't have to have that shame. I could just have it show up at my door. And the first time I did that, especially, I had no idea what I was doing, but I put on those clothes and I looked in the mirror and it just reinforced all that shame because what I saw was just sad in a depressing way. Like it was, oh, that's not that, like none of this is not only not even remotely my fantasy, it's like the worst fears of the expression of that fantasy, that I was a caricature in a very unfortunate way. So that would be a cycle where every 3 to 5 to 7 years I would try it, be disgusted, put everything literally in a box in the back of the closet and stop. I think a part of me knew that would always come back, that it wasn't something that was gone, which is why I didn't throw anything away. A lot of people talk about purge cycles. My mom taught me too much about not wasting things.
Right, you were too frugal. Okay, so you stay at Cardinal Health in Ohio for 5 years, periodically experimenting with dressing up, but feeling a lot of shame about it. And then in 2008, your career took you from Ohio to New York City, and that's when you started working at Pfizer, right?
It is. Yes. I took the job. I took the move for Pfizer. When I had the opportunity to go to New York, I leapt at it and it was great.
And can you tell us a little bit about your job at Pfizer?
I started off with a job to launch the company's first company-wide internal website that was called Pfizer World. And I helped launch that for the first few months of my job. But then I jumped over to the external world. I was in our corporate affairs and communications department, building a variety of different things, but almost entirely focused on our public web presence and on our public corporate social media. A couple of years ago, my role was moved from the communications department to the digital department at Pfizer, but my job is still effectively the same. I do our public web presence, Pfizer.com. My team also does all of our corporate social posting, involved in the look and feel of our different country sites around the world. So a whole bunch of things in the web world that consumes most of my days.
And when you moved to New York, in terms of your trans journey, there were several years of the status quo.
Yeah, it was the exact same thing. And kind of similar to leaving college, the first time I got to New York, restarted another one of those cycles where I again ordered some clothes, got the old clothes back out of the closet, tried things on, was again depressed, was again shoving it all away. When I looked in the mirror, if I looked in the mirror at all, it was someone going, well, yeah, what are you going to do? I didn't feel like I had no future, but I didn't necessarily have a future I was excited about. It was just schlubby old me. And I can be a cheerful, good friend, but that's what life is. And I think I'd almost let myself become a secondary character in life instead of my own main character.
I've heard you refer to this period of your life as a time when you just sort of cheerfully gave up.
Yeah, I felt like a pleasant person. I don't think of myself as unhappy, but I didn't necessarily expect that anything was ever going to change or be better outside of work. Work is probably the only place where I was still driving ahead because I felt like it was the one thing where I could still find some degree of achievement. I definitely stopped paying attention to my appearance. I gained a fair amount of weight. I grew a beard for that time. I know some people grew a beard because they saw it as like their denial beard. They wanted to do something hyper masculine. For me, I think it was, I don't really know if I care as much anymore. And I kind of just let things slide. That continued for a while until I got a wake-up call.
So, several years of living the status quo. And then your friend and colleague, Leilani, took you out for drinks and did a sort of one-woman intervention, which I love the way you have referred to this before. She slapped you in the face with some truth. Can you tell us about that? Everybody needs someone to slap you in the face with some truth every once in a while.
Yes, you so do. And it was remarkable for its bluntness. We worked together and we definitely were very close. She took me out for drinks after work. It just seemed like an average casual thing. But when I sat down, she really let me have it. And in a very loving way was like, what's going on? You have just been letting yourself go in almost every way. And something must be off. And I didn't share at that time what was going on with me. Because again, I didn't necessarily know, but I did take it to heart that I couldn't keep going like I was. And it gave me a bunch of different goals. I wanted to take better care of myself. I decided I wanted to get back to my college weight. I told myself, if I can hit that goal, if I can get back to that weight, I'm going to give that whole dressing up thing one more try. I told myself it was going to be the one last try. I think now in hindsight, I can say, well, it definitely wouldn't have gone away. I told myself if I work really hard at it, if I lose all the weight, if I start learning, I go online, I start looking at tutorials on YouTube, on Reddit, on Facebook. I start learning about what to do a better job in presenting myself better. If I can't get it right then let's call it. Like, this is your chance. Do it for yourself. And I did. I lost 35 pounds over the course of that year. And that January 1st of 2016, I woke up and I shaved off the beard and I shaved my arms and my legs. I shaved everything off. And I put together all of those lessons I had learned online. And when I looked in the mirror, it was such a pleasant surprise. So it was a very happy moment to be like, oh, yeah, this could fly. This can work.
So it was January of 2016 when you first looked in the mirror and saw a version of yourself that you liked. And we talk about this more in the background supplement, but you start going to this social club in Manhattan that was a safe place for people to go who wanted to explore their gender identity. So you'd go there, change, meet other people, share experiences, change back into your other clothes and go home. So you were enjoying dressing as a woman, experiencing that gender euphoria, but it was still quite a while before you realized or acknowledged that you were trans, right?
Yeah. Not because I didn't want to be, but because I believed I wasn't good enough. It's one of those different kinds of imposter syndromes that can hit.
And I know you went to therapy in part to get the validation you needed so you didn't feel like you were an imposter.
I found a therapist who specialized in trans care with her practice. And I remember 15 minutes in, it's a 45-minute session. I petered out after 15 minutes. I finally wound down in front of her. And I remember in this almost sarcastic way, she goes, yeah, okay, it's fair to say that you're transgender. She said it so lightly sarcastically,
Right.
Which was great, but it was also exactly what I needed to hear. I think the next day I reached out to my doctor to get hormones started.
And when you started the next phase of your transition, when you started taking hormones, or even before that, Did you ever think about the potential impact on your career? Did you have any concerns there?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I think it's fair to say that I didn't think about impacts on my career. And I don't know that there would have necessarily been any. I think being in almost any major city, not necessarily all of them, but thankfully a lot, and you're working in a corporate headquarters environment of a large organization, there typically are plenty of protections in place that I don't think I ever seriously considered that my role would be endangered. Now, that might have been a naive assumption, but it wasn't something that registered for me. But I think I was so more deeply concerned on the personal impacts to family, to my church life, to my friends, that I think work did not even come close to the radar. If there was a place I was fearful, it was in everything in my personal life, that I had never even made the mental leap to what it would mean beyond the personal life and the relationships with family.
And we talked about this more in the background supplement that I mentioned earlier, but the people in your personal life were actually quite supportive, thankfully.
Yeah. Well, I would say the worst I've ever gotten in anyone's reaction is neutral. Like, oh, okay, that's the worst I've ever gotten. It's a good question of what my experience might be if I didn't live here and I wasn't at my current stage of life when I came out and when I started to transition, because I got to do so with a lot of privilege. I get to live in an area where I've never felt any discomfort, getting to be the real version of myself, thankfully, at least so far. But I'm white, I'm well off. I transitioned later in life, which means I had more resources and more support networks in place. And I was lucky that those support networks didn't change and didn't go away when I transitioned. I'm single, which means I didn't have to worry about what would happen with family. So all those things made it a much simpler process for me. There's certainly still challenges, but I recognize I had a lot of hurdles removed that are present for a lot of others, which I think is part of why I not only feel like I've been blessed with how smoothly my transition went, but why I also feel comfortable talking about my transition, because I want to share that story and hopefully give some positive hope for others who might have more hurdles to encounter, which might mean that they're maybe less likely to share. And I want to be a story that I wish I could have heard when I was younger.
Oh, I love that. So you started taking hormones in 2019. You're working and your body is changing. And this is happening in the midst of a global pandemic. So very unique circumstances there.
And it's something where, again, it's one of those things where I recognize I had a privilege that might have been unique for the time that it was. The pandemic was unquestionably awful and a tragedy in so many ways. But for me and the timing of my journey, where I started hormones in late 2019 and then lockdowns were starting the spring of next year, it was almost perfect purely from that perspective of being able to transition at home. Where I was on camera, I was certainly seeing people on Zoom, Teams calls, and other sorts of WebEx things, but I was able to frame the camera very carefully on my face. My hair, which has been growing out for years and still is, I need a good hairstylist, but I was able to pull my hair back. I was able to wear a hoodie and cover my chest when that started to grow in. So I was able to carefully manage what people saw and when they saw it.
One of the things that really strikes me about the trans experience is all those years you're trying to figure out your gender identity, it's invisible. The struggle is so private, no one can see it. And then when you transition, it's something that's so visible, and it's such a drastic change.
That's part of why culture was so important in the office, because no one knew I was going through that for a very long time. So those statements of support, those moments where someone gets to be an ally, that's where the value of so many different things like sharing pronouns in your signature, all those different things, is because you never know who you're signaling that you're safe to. But there's a lot of people who are like me, taking their time working through things and keeping that very internal. And I've heard a lot of different places, especially maybe in more conservative areas or in manufacturing environments. I haven't heard that at Pfizer, but I've heard it at other companies. Literally people say, oh, we don't need to have that policy here. We don't have any of those people here. And it's like, well, you don't have any of those people that you know, because
of course,
who knows is going through this.
Right. And actually, I want to highlight a bit of your timeline because it underscores that point. Because you started working at Pfizer in 2008, started dressing up regularly in 2016, coming out to a few people you were close to over the next several years, but you didn't come out to everyone officially until August 2023. So that's 15 years that you were working at Pfizer and the majority of your colleagues had no idea what you were going through. But all that time, I'm sure that you were paying very close attention to whether this was a supportive environment in which to come out. So can you speak to that, to those aspects of Pfizer's culture that made you decide that this was a safe place for you to transition and ultimately to come out to your colleagues?
Absolutely. And obviously, when I'm speaking about Pfizer, I'm sharing my own thoughts, but also that I'm speaking of what it's like in the New York headquarters. But in New York headquarters, especially in the communications department where I started and where the first 14 and a half years of my career was at Pfizer, they were very accepting and very liberal. I sometimes joke, but I don't think it was too far off that like a quarter of the department was queer. There was a lot of LGBTQ people in the group. And in that lesson that visibility matters, perhaps most importantly, the head of that group, Sally Sussman, has been out as a lesbian since the 90s. So I knew at the very top of the organization that I was a part of, there was an LGBTQ person, and I felt like by extension, there was safety, that this was always going to be a comfortable and an accepting place.
And I should mention that Sally Sussman has held a number of very senior corporate roles, at Pfizer certainly, where she is a member of the C-suite, as well as prior senior roles at Estee Lauder and American Express. So representation obviously matters, and representation in senior leadership positions sends a very strong message, both internally and externally, that this is a safe place for members of the LGBTQ plus community. And Sally actually played a key role in both your coming out at Pfizer and providing you with a platform to share your story, which was really the springboard to more trans advocacy work, right?
Yeah. I had been having a meeting with Sally where I was leading the redesign of our site. So I was presenting and interviewing a number of senior executives and introducing them to our agency partners who are going to work on the project. And she saw me when I get on camera. And I've been at the company as long as she has. So I've seen her off and on for the entirety of the 16 years I've been at the company. But I guess that point 2.5 years ago, it had been a while since she had seen me. So I get on camera, and before I say anything, she goes, wait. I need to take this in. And so I try to joke off, I'm like, oh yeah, my hair used to be here, and I point at my chin, and now it's here, and I point at my hair. I kind of try to laugh off that I was just doing the style thing. And she goes, okay, go ahead. And we go ahead with the meeting.
But of course, she was onto you. She'd figured it out. And then I know you ended up calling her to talk about it. And how did that go?
I called her up. We had a great conversation, and she invited me right then to do a company-wide town hall to talk about coming out, which I loved. I love speaking and presenting, so I was all for that, but I was not ready. Like, let's talk in a couple of years, but I would love that. So finally, 2.5 years later, when I was ready to come out, even though I was now in a different division, I went, hey, Sally, I don't know if you remember this, that you offered this. And she's like, oh, absolutely. We're going to do it. So we end up recording an interview that was broadcast internally. It was done for Trans Awareness Week. So we made it a dual purpose video and interview. So instead of being one of our town halls, it ended up being a company-wide message about the Trans Awareness Week. But she also published it on her personal LinkedIn profile. So my catalyst to coming out was, well, I want her to be able to tag me when she posts that on LinkedIn. I want that 161,000 or however many people follow her to see this. So that means I need to come out. That accelerated my timetable a lot.
Well, and at a lot of large organizations, just some of the logistics associated with coming out can take a really long time. Things like changing your email. Was that a challenge?
They not only did it, they did it so fast. I thought when I asked for this, it was like, oh, we don't have a process. It'll take us a few days or it'll take us a week. The reply was, done. You should start seeing it in an hour.
That never happens. And I've heard many stories of people spending weeks agonizing over their coming out emails. But you had no time for all of that ruminating. And so I guess you can thank Sally for that. So it was August 2023 when you came out officially to everyone at Pfizer. What reaction did you get?
It was a joy. Like, everyone was always so excited that I got to share something with them personally. I feel like we always had then a very deep conversation. I feel like being able to unburden and reveal all of myself has invited a similar amount of sharing from others. And so that we get to have much deeper conversations than we ever had before. One of those testaments, I think, to Pfizer's culture, that if I was having a bad day, I would find someone to come out to.
That's terrific.
So every coming out was great. That I was almost sad when I finally came out to everybody.
It's like you became an adrenaline junkie, right?
Absolutely.
So your transition and coming out at Pfizer went incredibly smoothly. And I know that you attribute that to Pfizer's supportive, inclusive culture. And we've talked about one very important aspect of that, which is representation at both a senior leadership level and more broadly. So now I'd like to drill down on some of the other elements that contribute to an inclusive culture for trans colleagues. And one of the things that comes to mind for me, which of course is important for all marginalized groups, is a sense of community, where people have safe spaces to connect with others who may share certain similar experiences. Is there a strong LGBTQ plus community at Pfizer?
Absolutely. The oldest colleague resource group is OPEN, the Out Pfizer Employee Network, which started as a group of 4 colleagues back in the 90s who wanted to try to find ways to help each other. So it's a very informal thing, and it grew very slowly until Pfizer decided to recognize it as the first colleague resource group at the company. And now it's 20 some years later, we're up to 40 plus chapters around the world. It varies by what distribution list I look at, but I want to say 4,000 to 5,000 members, which includes allies and members of the LGBTQ community within it. So it was always a big organization and a very well supported organization.
And I know that Open does many things, from advocating for a more inclusive culture, both inside and outside the company, to organizing volunteer activities, educational events, networking opportunities, etc. But one of the things that caught my attention is the forum that it provides for members of Pfizer's LGBTQ plus community and their allies to share their stories in what's called the Pfizer Pride Journal. And I was surprised to learn that Open has been providing this forum for 18 years. And then for the past 3 years, these stories have been made public.
Yeah, it's one of the marquee things that Open does that we do for Pride every year. And it is stories that are shared at first internally, but now, as you noted, also externally, of LGBTQ colleagues, people who maybe have family member who's LGBTQ, allies, all kinds of different tales and stories that people thankfully are willing to share, to speak to the importance, the value, and the distance still to go in creating an inclusive and welcoming environment at Pfizer. And it's something where I've gotten to have the privilege of getting to contribute to, first and foremost, as a member of Open, where I was, of course, first an ally, but I started getting involved in updating Open's internal website and eventually became co-lead of our global communications. So for all those 40 regional chapters, I helped attempt to synchronize our communications around the world. And then in my day job, working on Pfizer.com, I also get to help publish and share the stories out there. So I've gotten to share that journal publicly the last 3 years externally. And in this last version, I finally got to include my own story.
You mentioned earlier that you work at Pfizer's New York corporate headquarters, where there's a very strong LGBTQ plus community. New York is a fairly liberal city, but of course Pfizer has locations all over the world. What do you think it means to people within Pfizer's LGBTQ plus community who work in other areas and in other types of facilities where things may be different and people may be struggling with, is this something that I should come out about? Is it safe to talk about? How much weight do you think this strong community and these stories carries for them? And what is the impact on the company's culture globally?
I think it's been an ever increasing thing. Like from the start, it was always amazing. But I think every year it's done a more impactful job of changing the culture and hopefully unifying the culture. Because I think it's something to say that certainly in, again, New York headquarters, things were always accepting. The places where we needed to do the most change and still need to are often in our manufacturing facilities, in our distribution centers, different places around the world, especially in those parts of the world where not only is it maybe more culturally conservative, it might actually be illegal to be LGBTQ. And so having the ability to share stories of others to give maybe a glimmer of hope, but also give an avenue of communication, different people and different ways to connect so that work can be a safe environment. Even if you don't get to express yourself, you might be able to make a connection with someone who can share that experience and help you manage through those challenges. And it's something that we think is not only helping people on a personal level, but also continues to influence and reinforce the company's policies, which certainly have always been very affirming and very positive, but we're certainly see become increasingly proactive. I know in our manufacturing organization, there are explicitly programs to make sure that trans and gender nonconforming folk in our manufacturing facilities, where there often isn't a lot of representation and culturally there might be more challenges, that it's really made clear that this is a safe place to be.
So let's talk about policies, which of course can play a crucial role in creating an affirming culture. Jess, what are some of the policies you've seen that you think are most effective in supporting trans people in the workplace?
It's a wonderful question. And certainly I know I'm not going to be inclusive of all the different things that companies and organizations can do, but there are some wonderful things to think about as an organization that's trying to be more affirming. And certainly at a baseline, but is the notion that officially any discrimination against people because of their trans identity should be explicitly prohibited. I think obviously just having that as a base rule within the company policies that we don't tolerate that here, regardless of what the situation might be in the local government or local policies outside of the office, that within the office, it's made clear that this behavior is tolerable and this behavior is not. And I think sometimes even just making that statement of what will be allowed and what won't be allowed goes a long way, both practically and in the overall sense of culture and sense of inclusion for trans colleagues to know that they are supported in not just voice, but in policy.
To take that one step further, and then that policy being enforced, right? So if anything does happen, there's real accountability there.
That's a great point. I think there's maybe an assumption if you have a policy, you're going to enforce it, but you're right. If you don't enforce it, you don't really have a policy. So making sure that people actually adhere to what they're saying is the standard is critical to making it clear to all colleagues, trans colleagues, but also everyone else too, what the culture is in truth and in practice for the office.
So there has been much ado about bathrooms recently. And of course, the bathroom use of transgender individuals has become a really divisive issue and a focal point of our current culture wars. And unfortunately, there's bound to be some spillover of that into our workplaces. So should organizations adopt a bathroom policy? And if so, any recommendations or best practices?
It's wonderful to have some transparency in what the bathroom policy is, perhaps especially as we enter into a situation where probably we'll see more anti-trans legislation be passed, some of which will target people trying to just do everyday things like going to the bathroom. So when you're in the workplace, for those of us in the private world of industry and employment, having a policy where you make it clear what is not allowed is very beneficial because obviously that's a day-to-day reality. It seems like a silly thing, and it is a silly thing that's become such a big flashpoint in a cultural war, but it's one of the most critical things for any human being to be out in public is that they're able to do some necessary things like use the bathroom. And that's one of the most insidious things about using bathrooms as a flashpoint in the cultural war is that it makes it so difficult just to be day-to-day. If you have to go home to go to the bathroom, if you have to hold it, there's all kinds of health risks, all kinds of negative things, not just psychologically, but physically that result from such aggressively negative policies. And so that's one thing that companies can do, whether it's actually having gender neutral bathrooms in place, which is certainly a wonderful thing to have if possible, or just to affirm that people can use the bathroom that they can identify with. But I think in those areas where legislation might prohibit people being able to use the bathroom that they identify with, that's where making a space for a gender neutral bathroom somewhere can be so critical to allow people to still have a place to go, especially when they're not allowed to use the bathroom they normally would use otherwise.
You mentioned pronouns earlier. Do you think companies should adopt a pronoun policy, or is that something that just flows from the culture?
I tend to the idea that that is something that should flow from the culture. If people are using and sharing pronouns, it ideally should grow from a place because they believe that's what's right and that's what's nice and inclusive to do. And so if it becomes something that you're trying to enforce, that almost can have the opposite effect and can be problematic in trying to demand people behave a certain way versus educating them on how ideally they should want to behave. And so I think pronouns isn't necessarily something that goes hand in hand with policy, but goes hand in hand with training.
Can you talk a little bit more about the significance of sharing pronouns? Because this is an issue that some people don't understand or may be uncomfortable with.
It's an important question because it can be an awkward one. I know I feel that. I don't want to necessarily other myself by being the person to say their pronouns. And just like it can feel awkward for someone who says it. It's like, well, why do I need to say it? Everyone knows my pronouns, which kind of hits at the core of the problem because not everyone knows everyone's pronouns. That's one of the things that are awkward. And I think, well, I can be concerned about what people will think of me and how I appear, how they subconsciously perceive my voice, and the value of expressing pronouns so that they don't have to be in an awkward situation where they say the wrong thing, especially if their intent isn't ill. If they want to get it right, sometimes it's helpful to be able to know that before they engage with me. They don't have to discover it in an embarrassing way. But for non-binary people, where people aren't as comfortable saying they, them, or just don't know off of visual cues whether or not they, them is appropriate, it especially can be beneficial. And so I think when we ask people to share their pronouns, part of it is to make it easier for people like me, people who are non-binary, people who have a need maybe to have their pronouns being known without them having to correct it awkwardly in the moment. There's definitely value there.
Right. It normalizes it.
I think when we ask people to share pronouns, sharing the value of why it helps and how it makes people feel better is a big way to help people understand why, as allies, it's valuable to do it.
Yeah, because as an ally, if I understand that, why wouldn't I want to do that? And then, of course, sharing pronouns doesn't have to be a part of every conversation.
I think an easy place to start is in your email signature on WebEx calls and Teams calls and Zoom calls, having your pronouns in parentheses. It doesn't have to be something that we call significant verbal attention to or spoken attention to. It can be something that is more quietly expressed.
You also mentioned earlier that there's a signaling aspect to sharing pronouns. Can you explain what you mean by that?
For me, before I was out, when I was thinking about who I wanted to talk to and who I wanted to come out to, the first people I came out to were all the allies who shared their pronouns in their email signature or in their Zoom calls or wherever it might be, because I knew that they were safe. It was a signal that even though they didn't know this about me, I knew that they would be open to me sharing. And I think those signals to marginalized communities like the trans community to see those pronouns, I think it extends to other communities. I don't think it's wrong to say that if someone is accepting of one marginalized community, like the LGBTQ plus community, that they will often be more inclusive of others as well. And so I think it sends a nice signal, not just to out trans people, not just to closeted trans people, but to any other minority or marginalized group. Seeing pronouns means you're in a place that's probably more likely to be safe, and you're with people who are probably more likely to be respectful and inclusive of you. It has ramifications far beyond just for trans folks like me.
So educating people about why pronouns are important, about how the practice positively impacts people, the signal that sharing pronouns sends, all of that can be very valuable. And of course, workplace training programs can be a good forum for those conversations. And that brings us to the value of holding training programs about gender diversity more generally and why that matters so much. Jess, could you speak to that a little bit?
Holding gender diversity training, holding sessions where people can learn more about what the reality of our existence is, and that trans people, intersex people, non-binary people are real, have been real for centuries and millennia, is valuable. And then how they can be a part of the workplace, and not just why that should be good and right in and of itself, but how that leads to a more effective, more productive, and happier workplace for all.
Right, and also not placing the burden on people who are trans, who are often expected to educate everyone and to answer everyone's questions.
Right. And that's where having training is so effective, to take the burden off of the trans people having to share and almost justify in some cases their existence, or even just handle basics that they themselves might not know all the answers to, can be resolved by having dedicated training to share some of the base level knowledge that many people might want to have but lack. It lets people ask the questions and get the answers without having to put an onus on trans people, and without having to make it quite as awkward for those people who are asking questions. A safe space where you can do training and you can ask those fundamentals and hear the answers is extremely effective to making the broader workplace more inclusive and less prone to misunderstanding and mistakes.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a lot of different things that contribute to a positive, supportive culture for trans colleagues. To recap a little bit, we talked about representation and how having LGBTQ plus representation at the most senior levels of an organization sends a very strong message that the environment is a safe one for members of the LGBTQ plus community. We talked about the importance of creating safe spaces for trans people and others to share their stories and connect with others who may have experienced similar things, both for the benefit of people who are out and people who are wondering whether it's safe to transition or come out. We've talked about the importance of establishing policies that send a clear message to trans individuals that the organization sees them, respects them for who they are, and wants them to bring their whole authentic selves to work. And we have talked about the importance of education and training about things like why pronouns matter and what language is appropriate to avoid inadvertently offending or embarrassing someone. And of course, there's so much more that we could talk about. Healthcare, for example, ensuring that providers are knowledgeable about trans care. The list goes on. But Jess, zooming out to 35,000 feet, in your opinion, what do you think is the number one thing that workplaces need to do to create a trans-inclusive culture? And what is the number one thing that you think Pfizer gets right?
I think the number one thing that Pfizer gets right is that they have a culture that we want to make things right for us. Because there's lots of individual policies that spill out from that, but I think it goes back to the core notion that being respectful of everybody is the right thing to do. And I think that certainly is true morally, and I believe that we stand by it.
Well, and that enables everyone to bring their whole selves to work, which is better for everyone's mental health and well-being, certainly, but also has other implications, other benefits for the business, I'd imagine.
If people get to be themselves at work and get to bring their whole selves to work and don't have to hide that, they are more productive. They are less likely to leave. The retention, by extension, costs or having to rehire is far lower. Across the board, it is universally a more productive and more effective environment with fewer costs and fewer turnover challenges. So right off the bat, having that notion that we respect everybody and that we respect them to the extent that we want them to be themselves unabashedly is the most fundamental thing that Pfizer is currently getting right. And it helps that when we do that, it translates so naturally into then, and that's why we have this policy. That's why we encourage you to attend this training or to talk about people this way, and why we might be hiring for different communities to help make our company reflect the population, not just of our country, but arguably of the world and our customer base.
So I'd like to spend some time talking about some concrete things individuals in the workplace can do, things people listening to this conversation today can do to contribute to a trans-inclusive workplace, because of course we all have a role to play. And let's start at the top, because so much flows from there. So Jess, what do you think are the most important things that senior leaders can do to support trans individuals at work, whether they're transitioning or coming out, or wondering if it's safe to come out?
I think at the senior leadership level, there's a lot we can ask them to do. I think it's become a unique challenge lately as we've watched a lot of companies grapple with the culture wars here in the US and the decision to use trans issues as a wedge culture issue. I think personally very maliciously, not because necessarily it comes out of a belief, but more of this is a minority that we always thought was weird, so let's use them. Let's exploit this minority who we didn't think was going to support us anyway, kind of perspective. And it's being resonating down through lots of different leaderships at lots of different organizations who are grappling with what it means to hold up their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or their belonging programs and what their commitment is there and whether or not they feel like they need to kowtow to a portion of their culture. And I know people who disagree with DEI probably feel like they're already kowtowing in a different way. I believe strongly that's not the case, that everyone should get a chance to be themselves at work. But sadly, we're watching a lot of companies roll back their commitment to DEI.
Right. And this is DE&I more generally, not just trans. There's been controversy at a much broader level.
You're absolutely right. And that's where, it's a broader issue that the trans experience and the question of what they can do to support lives inside of. Because we've seen the largest political ad spend in the last few weeks has been on anti-trans commercials from the conservative side of the aisle. And it's very erosive, not just to voters, because I think we're seeing it's not necessarily resonating with many outside the base from voters, but it's being very erosive on cultural norms and expectations, where there has been negative seen and less support expressed for inclusive policies than there used to be. So even if they are not fans of the commercials, even if they're not going to vote because of those commercials, they are having a direct impact on policy and on opinions. And unfortunately, seeing companies also take a step back has a very direct impact on certainly all equity and inclusion programs. But for the trans community, corporations were in some ways one of the biggest bright spots not too long ago. During the passage of HB2 in North Carolina, and the bathroom bill there.
And for the benefit of our listeners, HB2 or House Bill 2 was a North Carolina statute passed in March of 2016 to compel schools and other public facilities to restrict use of gender-segregated bathrooms to people with the corresponding sex as listed on their birth certificate.
And it was the NBA, it was commercial organizations taking a stance against it that saw that go away and get rolled back because it was neither in their moral or economic interests to allow that to happen. And I think internally there's still lots of beliefs. It's challenging now to ask senior leaders to step up in that same way, unfortunately. I think the biggest things leaders can do is make strong commitments to the values of the company, and that those values are something that the company will live by and won't be subject to whims outside the company. It's something where even in talking about what we're committing to, I'm seeing more commitment being talked about towards race and not so much towards the LGBTQ community, or especially trans people, which is particularly concerning because it can give the impression that, oh, are we the ones who will be left on the side of the road in trying to find a balance between these different extremes? I hope that's a cynical view that's just being fed by the current narrative. I hope it will change. But the biggest thing senior leaders can do if you don't have explicit representation within leadership is to make that commitment to the community clear.
Well, and I think that this is something that younger generations really care about and are presumably paying attention to when deciding where they want to work.
Absolutely. I think Gen Z is up to 20-some%. Gen Alpha might be higher percent that see themselves as part of the LGBTQ community. It's the best thing I would like to think a company could do to ensure that pipeline for the future stays solid is living up to those values, because those generations don't see it as an option. They see it as table stakes. For the companies that roll back their commitments, for those senior leaders who don't maintain their commitments, I think it's going to be a mistake that will negatively rebound. It might take a few years before it hits, but future generations are not going to be tolerant of the companies that decided it wasn't worth standing by them.
I agree. And I also think that that sends a message to every other marginalized group. If you're not willing to stand up for this group, then what does that mean for everybody else, right?
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about managers, individual supervisors? How can they contribute to creating and maintaining a trans-inclusive culture?
I think anytime you have the potential to have reports, you have an opportunity to address how you're going to make them as comfortable as they can be in the workplace. And that's not just for trans people, that's across the board. And again, I would hope that that comes from a belief that that's just the right thing to do. But as we mentioned with other broader policies, we know that makes people more effective. It makes them more productive. It makes them less likely to leave. So I think as an individual leader, as a person who's a people manager, not necessarily at a senior level, thinking about what behaviors you signal is huge, especially if you have someone like me who maybe was a part of your team but wasn't out. How do you make it clear that this will be a comfortable place? And I think that comes into play in a lot of simple, easy ways. We've already talked about adding pronouns into signatures on your email. Easy way to show that you're going to be an accepting place. You're going to be an inclusive place. When you have team meetings, when you talk about what else is going on in the company, being able to say, hey, this affinity group is meeting this week. Here's a link if anyone's interested in attending, I'll be going. Being able to show a direct commitment and invite others to do it is an easy way to make your allyship known, especially because it's not something that you're forcing on people. You're inviting them into what you're already doing. And people will want to follow their leaders, sometimes just because it feels good, sometimes because they believe they should, because it's smart to get ahead. Frankly, whatever their motivation, if you provide a path for people to find more ways to connect with others, learn about others, and be empathetic towards others, you'll create a better environment.
And what about just colleagues generally? Maybe you're not a manager or supervisor at all, but you work with somebody and they're transitioning, they come out to you. Like what can you do? What would be the number one that you've experienced from your colleagues that have meant the most to you?
One of the most wonderful things that you can do is ask that question of the person who's going out. What can I do for you? What can I do to make this easier, better for you? Because a lot of the experiences are individual. What worked for me might not be what other people want. And what I'm comfortable with or comfortable letting slide might not be the same thing for others. So asking, saying, hey, this is new to me. I want to learn more. I want to do what I can to help you is definitely one of the best things you can do. That's, again, obviously for people who are out or who come out. So I think there's that notion of what are you already doing right now so that if someone wanted to come out, they know that you're someone who will be comfortable, who will be friendly and excited. And I think that's one thing to also ponder when someone does come out to you, or when you want to set the stage for someone to come out to you, is how would you receive it? Is it something that you would receive with confusion or with distress or with lots of questions? Or is it something that you would be able to receive with joy? Most people who I came out to were joyful because I was sharing a part of myself that I had not previously been comfortable sharing. And they felt, I think, blessed that they were someone to receive that sharing, to hear that and to receive it. Even for people who I was a little bit scared sharing with, people who I knew from different faith communities in the past, where I believe that there's no conflict at all being LGBTQ and being a Christian. I recognize that is not the belief of a lot of people. But even where I knew people didn't believe as I did, when I did share with them, they were still affirming and saying that I love you as a person. I'm glad you're sharing this with me. And there might be some things to work through, but let's celebrate in the moment that you felt like you could share with me.
There's a documentary I watched recently on Netflix called Will and Harper. And it's with Will Ferrell and his dear friend Harper, who transitioned male to female in her late 50s, I believe. And they go on this road trip across the country and talk about what Harper's transitioning means for their friendship. It's a really great documentary that I highly recommend. And during their trip, they stopped to visit Harper's sister. And she recalls when she learned what was going on with Harper and that Harper was transitioning. And Harper came out to her by email as she did everyone else. And her sister said, I wanted to respond quickly because I didn't want her to think I had to think about it. And then what she chose to say was, I always wanted a sister. Oh my goodness, though, it was so moving. I got all choked up when she said that. So much love there. One of the things a lot of people worry about when someone comes out to them is saying the wrong thing or making a mistake. They may have questions that they're afraid to ask because they don't know what's appropriate to ask. They don't want to offend. They don't know what the rules of engagement are. What would you say to someone who is afraid of doing the wrong thing?
I very much get this. I'm an extreme people-oriented person. I was always concerned about other people. And so I always want to put people at ease. So I recognize that anxiety, but not everyone does. I think it's good to try to do a little bit of self-education and checking before engaging, because it is very much a personal preference, right? That what people are willing to say, how they want to engage, and what they're willing to share can be such a personal thing that can be driven by so many different motivations that it can be a bit of a minefield to figure out what to do or what to say. So I think a couple of things to know, some general truisms as well as some approaches. I would say if you want to ask something that you're not sure about, try to do it one-on-one. Don't try to do it with a group. I think it's always going to be a little bit more comfortable or less likely to cause discomfort if you can do that, if you can pull someone aside or have a moment to quietly say something. I think it's good to lead with what you just said, to say, I'm not sure what to do here. I'm uncomfortable at it. I don't want to get it wrong. Please correct me. I think inviting that correction helps you learn, but also helps invite a bit of forgiveness to get there comfortably and calmly.
100%. Jess, is there anything you've been asked that you felt crossed the line? Anything that you felt was overly intrusive?
I've encountered this with some people, including some close friends, people who did some of the traditional questions that you might have heard in the past, which surprised me. I think I got almost used to being in liberal New York and people being a little bit more cautious. I had people ask about, when are you getting the surgery, or other kinds of things like that. And so I think it's a good general byword in almost any interaction, not just with trans people. Don't ask about other people's genitalia. That's just a general life rule. That's not really okay.
That sounds like good advice.
I get how it's fascinating, or I get how there's different presumptions or assumptions that go into what it means to transition, because it doesn't necessarily involve any of those things. Or, it could be just how you present. It could be medical with hormones. It could be medical with surgery. It could be other things, none of those things. And all of it's valid. and none of it's necessarily any of your business, right? So I think it's still one of those things to keep in mind is, are you asking because it's a purient thing you're curious about? Or are you asking because it helps and how you can engage with this person or how you can be respectful towards them? But I think it's a general thing to not assume that trans people are there to satisfy your curiosity, right? They're there just to be people.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend recently whose son transitioned. And she told me that one of the things he experienced at work was feeling like he had to be the face and the voice of all of transgenderhood at all times, which he found exhausting. And all he really wanted to do was quietly live his life as the gender he knew he was meant to be.
Yeah, and understandably so. I think it's one of the things where we can always speak in the abstract of what it means to share your experience and share your truth and kind of forget that we're still asking someone to share, which is not something that all people want to do, at least not all the time.
Now, since coming out in August 2023, you have been attending a lot of conferences, doing a lot of presentations, and sharing your story in various forums like this one, and thank you very much for that. What is it that motivates you to speak publicly about your personal story?
I think everyone has different talents that they enjoy bringing to bear in different ways. In some ways, it actually is self-satisfying to have opportunities to speak in ways that are a bit less focused on just the day-to-day reality of the technical world that I'm involved in. And while that's a pleasure, I recognize it's also a privilege and opportunity that not everyone has, both that I've had opportunities to speak and that I have a comfort in speaking that not everyone has. And so that's something where I feel like if I have those gifts, that it's almost wrong not to use them as much as I can, or hopefully effectively as I can. I think there's a lot of truth in the knowledge that it's harder to hate someone once you start to get to know them. And so I figure if I'm already someone who is fairly gregarious and wants to be friendly and wants to engage with other people, if I can find more ways to get them to know me, then hopefully there's going to be less angst to encounter out in the world, and not just for me, but for others.
Amen to that. Now, Jess, you have referred to your personal trans journey as your journey to self-acceptance. Where are you on that journey now?
I am pretty far along in that journey. I think for me, the big self-acceptance I had to do was just acknowledging that I was trans, not because it was a fight to accept that I was trans. It's because I didn't feel like I was trans enough. For me to get over that hurdle was everything. And now that I'm past that hurdle, things have opened up so much. And I think the ability to accept myself has translated in so many ways to other parts of my life where I feel like I bring more joy to them than I did before, not because I wasn't a cheerful person, but because there's one less mental hurdle that's holding me back.
You wrote in a blog I read, "I am excited, happy, and optimistic to an extreme I never knew before. And I am so grateful that any of this is possible." And as you've shared, much of your transition and your coming out has been a story of support, acceptance, and joy. Now, a lot has happened since then. We started this conversation before the election at a time when there were a lot of anti-trans ads coming out from the conservative side of the aisle. As I'm talking to you now, it's November 9th. So the election is now over, and we've just learned the results. And of course, there's been a decisive victory for Donald Trump, whose campaign ran those ads. Now, I'm sure you're still processing it, but given that the trans community was specifically targeted as part of that campaign, can you share how you feel in this moment?
There are always hurdles. There will be more. This probably was always going to be a generational fight that we've only been part of the way through, that some of it got to accelerate faster than most people expected, that there was more trans inclusion, at least for a period of time, more rapidly than with most marginalized communities, was a wonderful gift. It's something that let me be me in a way that if it hadn't happened, if there hadn't been broader acceptance in the prior decade, I don't know if I would have been as eager to be myself now. And I'm fearful for some that they might be in a place where it's not as a clear a path to come out as it was for me now, as we see a bit of a rollback. But that doesn't have to mean that things are over or that things are going to roll back entirely. I think it's a reminder of what we want to get back to and what we're going to push for as the standard. And I'd like to think that that's possible. It just might take longer and be harder than we all thought.
And what would you say is the message for the LGBTQ plus community at this moment in time?
I think the message we're probably looking at is not a new message for the LGBTQ plus community. And that's a message of protest. Pride was born in protest. It was not a celebration at the start. It was a riot at the start because it was a refusal to accept the status quo that a minority of vocal negative people have put into place. I think most people don't care at worst about trans people and more accepting than we think. When I travel across the country, especially in areas where I'm scared, I found that generally speaking, people have treated me with grace and kindness. And I'd like to believe that's still true in people's soul. Unfortunately, a part of electing the new administration comes with a number of people who don't care about those things and are going to be very antagonistic. And so we can't allow that to be assumed to truly be the norm or the majority of this country. It's not the majority opinion, and it won't be accepted. Even if legislation's passed, it won't be accepted. The fight won't stop. It will only get louder and stronger, as it should, for anything that is an injustice. We're required to stand up to it.
Hope will never be silent. And of course, that includes our workplaces. Jess, you mentioned earlier that it was the NBA and other commercial organizations that took a stand against HB2, the bathroom bill. We talked about the importance of senior leaders making their commitment to the LGBTQ plus community clear. And of course, every one of us contributing to an inclusive culture where members of the LGBTQ plus community, members of the trans community, are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. So Jess, I have something that I want to say to you. We are big believers in storytelling here at Reimagining the Workplace, and I am personally so honored and grateful when someone is willing to share their personal story with me. I've had several guests come on to share their mental health challenges, their biggest fears and anxieties, and it is something that I never ever take for granted. You mentioned earlier that by coming out to others at work, those relationships became deeper and people started sharing more and engaging more authentically with you. And I think that more broadly, at a time when there was so much division and lack of understanding, both generally and with respect to the trans experience in particular, you coming here and sharing your story so openly and being willing to do such a deep dive, I think it's incredibly brave, and I think it can play a very meaningful role in increasing understanding and perhaps bringing us all just a little bit closer together, in our workplaces certainly, but also in our communities and around the world. In the words of Laverne Cox, and I'm quoting her from a 2014 Time magazine article, when people have points of reference that are humanizing, that demystifies difference. And now, as much as ever before, that feels to me to be not just important, but crucial.
Thank you so much for saying that. I can only hope that anything I put out into the world is beneficial, but having allies like you who are willing to hear this story and having an audience, hopefully, who's going to be receptive to it, it's everything. Because I can only take things so far myself, and I can only expect so much from the people I interact with every day. And the need to be myself all the time ultimately requires something that is much broader than just who I happen to know day to day. It's something that we need to hopefully find that sense that everyone wants to be a little bit closer together across all of us, across our whole world, frankly, and having people who are willing to listen to different stories and who are helping us elevate those stories and amplify them in places where we aren't ourselves is so crucial to making any of that remotely possible. Because we can only do so much in our own little echo chambers. It's people who are willing to dip into something they're not familiar with and learn more about it and then share it that make any kind of growth possible. So thank you as well.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Okay, so we need to start winding down. But Jess, before I let you go, are there any resources you'd like to share with our listeners?
There's so much out there. There's lots of online communities, and that's the biggest resource that's available. There's lots of great websites from the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, all kinds of different organizations that share a lot of guides and guidance for both employers, employees, and just people living their everyday life that are wonderful resources to tap into. But if you can find an individual community, I found a lot of them on Reddit. There's a lot of communities on Discord, different groups, organizations that might be collections of either LGBTQ plus individuals who've gathered or actually have a more structured organization or volunteer group that they connect with. But finding those different communities to tap into is one of the best ways to say, hey, what is not only a great resource for me, but what are the local organizations I can tap into? What are the local people I can meet with and talk to? Finding those communities is the best path to finding all of the resources available, especially the ones that can be most tailored to you and where you are.
Sounds like good advice. And with that, we are out of time. Jess, thank you again for spending so much time with me and for sharing so much of your personal story and so many valuable insights for our listeners about how to create better, more inclusive workplaces for members of the trans community.
This was an awesome opportunity and a very enjoyable experience. So I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Reimagining the Workplace. I'm Jessica Cherry, and as always, thanks so much for listening.